Welcome, everyone, to the Over Under podcast, where we talk about movies and argue whether they're overrated or underrated. I'm joined, as always, by my good friend, Dylan DeAngelis. And we have a very special guest today. It's Miss Georgia Shenk. Georgia, you are a comedian, a performer, a writer. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, I have been doing improv since I was about 8. I live in New York. I've been doing comedy professionally since 2018, and I also write screenplays and essays.
Amazing. So today we're talking about a very special movie that I don't think a lot of people have seen. This is Sleeping with Other People. Georgia, I asked you to be on this episode because one of my friends had just watched this and didn't like it, and I was like, well, I know the person who likes this movie the most in the world, so I would like to talk about it. Georgia, why don't you give us the rundown of what this movie is while I fix my camera?
Absolutely. So Sleeping with Other People is a movie about two people, Jake and Lainey, who lost their virginities to each other in college, and then 13 years later meet each other at a sex addicts meeting and decide to go on one date where they decide to keep it platonic, and they both realize that they are not really in the right headspace to date other people. And so they form a friendship that develops throughout the end of the movie. And we have to see if they decide to stay just friends or start sleeping with each other.
Yeah. So this movie came out in 2015. It has like a pretty stacked lineup of 2015 or mid 2010s comedy talent from film and television. Jason Sudeikis, Alison, Brie, Natasha Lyonne, Amanda Peet. Dylan, when you saw this cast, did that get you excited for the movie?
Yeah, I mean, we just recently recorded an episode on Will Ferrell, and this movie is one of those Adam McKay, Will Ferrell jump scares because they're the producers on this film, even though it's kind of tough to tell because it doesn't come off as like a normal like Adam McKay movie, even though it's got at least two actors from Step Brothers. It might have more. But yeah, like looking at the cast, I was like, oh, this is really cool. And I thought that it would be in a similar vein as a lot of other movies that were like this that came out in the 2000s and 2010s. Like the movies that I have up on my other screen here are like No Strings Attached, Friends with Benefits, Knocked Up. Like I would assume it would be like in the vein of those films. And it's kind of not. I mean, for one, it has a much, much lower budget than those other movies. This movie had a reported budget of $3 million, which is absurd for like the cast. Like you would think that $3 million would just go to the actors, like given the caliber of actor that they have in this movie. But I guess it makes sense. I was doing a little bit more research in this movie because like Cards on the Table, I'd never heard of this movie before. And obviously I'd heard of these actors before, and looking into it, like the woman that directed this film, she's mainly a TV writer and director. So in a lot of ways, this feels like a movie that was made by somebody who specializes in TV. It's shot very flat. It's like very like basic like colors and like lockdown cameras, nothing like too crazy going on. It's a very interesting movie. So when Jason told me like we were doing this movie for a podcast, I was very interested to see why this movie in particular is the one that like you're in love with.
It's a great question.
Yeah, feel free to tell us.
So I will jump in there. I saw this movie for the first time in like 2015, and I was on like a Jason Sudeikis marathon at the time. I really didn't have any expectations for it. I was just like binging, and I put it on, and it was like freshly after I had been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and I was coming to terms with like my own bad dating habits. And so I was 19 when I watched it, fell in love with it. And it was the first time I felt like I saw myself as a crazy bitch presented in film. And ever since then, I've gotten better. And I credit this movie a lot with how I have been able to find better habits.
Nice. Now, when I listened to the last podcast you did where you talked about this movie, you said that you watched it multiple times a week. How often are you watching it nowadays?
Currently not as frequently. Mm-hmm. I watched it about an hour ago before we filmed the podcast, and I still feel really, really good about the movie. It's almost 10 years since I saw it for the first time, so I'm definitely not in the same headspace as I was the first time I watched it. but I do love it. And I love Leslie Headland, the director and screenwriter's writing. She did Russian Doll. She did Bachelorette. And she actually was a playwright before she was anything else, which I found very interesting in terms of reading the actual screenplays and things she's done since.
Cool. So, Dylan, you told me as we were watching this that you think this fails as a romantic comedy on the romantic level and the comedy level. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, despite the fact that it's a Adam McKay, Will Ferrell production, it's interesting how little like actual comedy is in this movie. It's a really weird structure for a film. When I compare it to other like rom-coms, you know, they tend to try to hit that balance of like the romance and the comedy. I guess like the one thing that makes this movie unique is that it really pushes like sex is like the main topic more than romance. So when you have these two characters, like they get together because they have sex with each other. And then basically the whole plot is moving forward based on like these people wanting to have sex with other people. One thing I brought up to Jason, because Jason used to live in New York, this feels like a very New York movie. It's based in New York. They meet each other at Columbia for the first time. They're making a lot of pop cultural references that feel very like liberal, intellectual New York person. Like the overall like dating culture that these people are going out into, like it feels like a world that I am not personally familiar with, but it's possible that people that are from New York might like see this and go, oh my God, I relate to this so hard.
I do. So I didn't go to Columbia, but I live on the street next to pianos where they have their first like date. So I've been there. I've traversed over to the Upper West Side where Jason Sudeikis gets hit by the car in the beginning. There's lots of like fun New York classic scenery taking place in the background. Yeah, I love it.
Good. Yeah, I think this was like a funny movie. I think at first it feels like it's going to be like a more standard raunchy R-rated comedy. I think like the scene with what's his name, Adam Brody freaking out in the restaurant is like a really funny scene and kind of sets the tone for something that's a little bit different than what the movie ends up being. But I still think there's a lot of humor in here and jokes that land.
Yeah, I think that was like my major issue coming out of the movie more than anything is that, I mean, it kind of makes it a difficult movie to talk about because it's so whelming of a film. It doesn't like pull you or push you in any one direction extremely. Like it's not insanely raunchy. Like despite this movie being entirely about sex, I don't think there's like any nudity in this movie at all. Like in any of the sex scenes, they're like pretty like I guess tastefully shot. So they don't go like really hard into like being like overly sexy with it. They don't go like overly hard into like referencing like Knocked Up. Like Seth Rogen movies have like a lot of drug use in them and a lot of like schlubby dudes. Like there's none of that. There's one scene that comes out of fucking nowhere where they decide to take Molly before going to a child's birthday party when there was like no inkling of like excessive hard drug use at all until that point in the movie. I understand that this is like kind of the director writing a movie about herself a little bit.
Yeah, definitely.
It's possible that these are just like things that she experienced in real life and she is just writing out a screenplay that is things that have happened to her as they happened. And when you write a screenplay like that, it kind of leads you into an issue of, well, maybe the movie's not going to have very good pacing because of that. And I remember like 20 minutes into this movie, I asked Jason, I was like, what is the big twist of this movie? What is going to be the rub? What is going to be the thing that kind of makes it unique and makes this movie stand out? And there's really nothing. Like that plot that you described at the very beginning of the pod here, that's basically that's the entire plot of the film. Right. I guess like spoilers, they end up together at the end. Yeah. That's the only major decision that's ever needed to be made. There is no major moment where they accidentally have sex with each other and it like ruins their friendship and they have to break up for a while and they stop talking. No, interestingly enough, the villain of this movie is like fatherhood and being like a stable parent. They portray, what's his name? Jason Mantzoukas, I think is his name. He's like the antithesis of Jason Sudeikis' character where he's just a loving husband and father. And the movie almost treats him as like a cautionary tale. Of like, look at this guy. He lives in like a big house with his wife and his son, and he's fucking miserable. And it's just interesting. It's a very interesting way to like try to build out your cast of characters, which is why I think it's probably just the director pulling from people she knows in real life and trying to build a story around it. So that's speculation.
That's really interesting. I would not pull or separate Mantzoukas out as the antagonist. If anything, I think it's Adam Scott, who's just like a wet rat throughout this entire movie. But I see Mantzoukas more as a foil who is like there to challenge Jake throughout the plot of the film. I also think the most comparable movie to this would not be like a Knocked Up. It would be When Harry Met Sally. And if you go through like the interviews that Leslie Headland did about this film, she calls it When Harry Met Sally for assholes. I don't think it's above criticism. I think she could have leaned further into them both being assholes.
I would agree. These characters are not nearly unlikable enough for that to be the elevator pitch of this movie.
Right.
Okay, so let's talk about a scene that I know Dylan had a lot of thoughts on, and then I listened to you talk about it on your podcast, the green tea bottle scene where Jason Sudeikis explains to Alison Brie the proper technique for fingering herself.
I couldn't believe, like, after watching that scene, I was like, there's no way a woman directed this movie. This is insane.
So, Leslie Headland is bisexual. And she, when I have gone back through her interviews, has said that like this was pulled from her explaining to people she went to college with how to finger women and how to figure themselves. So that's kind of the explanation there. And she's using Jake as like a puppet for herself at that point in the film.
Yeah, and the issue that comes with that is that like these characters are like their mid-30s or something like that.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's a little bit different circumstance.
Than like being a college freshman.
Being in college,
right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And again, like when I watched this for the first time, I was 19, which is more around the age Leslie Headland would have been when she was going through that in her actual life. So, of course, at the time, it wasn't like something that stood out to me. It's like, oh, this is weird. But like as a 28-year-old, I'm like, yeah, I can see why that's a divisive scene in the movie.
Yeah, that scene goes on way too long, too. He goes through like 4 different stages of what you're supposed to do. And I'm like, we can cut this down like a lot. In fact, like just cut the whole scene out of the movie. It's not necessary.
Maybe all 4 stages are important, Dylan. Maybe
listen, I'm not going to dispute that the elements are it's fair. In fact, if this was like a man explaining it to another man, like I could understand it. But him like explaining it to a woman in her mid-30s who is a sex addict, you're saying like this is a woman that's like never masturbated before? Am I supposed to believe that?
Right. Well, I also don't think Lainey is actually a sex addict. I believe Jake probably is, but I don't believe Lainey is because she goes celibate for so long, and an actual sex addict really wouldn't be able to do that or would have more challenges. I think she is addicted to like the feeling of like acceptance that she gets whenever Adam Scott picks up the phone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the meeting that they go to and reunite at is called Sex and Love Addiction. So she's like a love addict and he's a sex addict. Yeah, he even explains it at the beginning that if she has sex with Adam Scott when they're in college, that she's going to be addicted to
mediocrity.
Yeah. I think, Dylan, when you said there's like no big twist or major rub in this movie, I do think that's true, but I think there are really interesting obstacles that both of the characters have to overcome before they can be together. Adam Scott being one of them. And then internally, they both have different struggles that they face and help each other with. And then there's another obstacle before they can get together, which is Paula, the woman that Jake pursues. She's his boss. He enters a relationship with her, and then he is still in love with Lainey. Georgia, you said on your podcast that you can't stand Paula.
I have more grace for her now. What I will say is that I don't understand the motivations that Paula makes, because like at several points throughout the movie, she is told that Jake has feelings for Lainey. They have sex together. He says her name, and then they decide she introduces her kid to him. And like, I would love to know what the conversation was that made that okay to proceed before she gets angry at him for the exact same thing a scene later.
Yeah, this movie should be like 40 minutes long because it should end right when he hits on her for the first time. And then she just says like, you're not allowed to do that. Like, I'm reporting you to HR.
Yeah, HR violation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a question. This is maybe more a personal question, but you tweeted once that your ex once yelled at you that he
Yes,
was a
he.
Paula. Can you tell us that story?
Sure. So I had a terrible boyfriend for a very long time, 4 years. And I broke up with him because he had been cheating on me for like a substantial amount of time. But I also had like reconciled with my high school boyfriend at the time. And I wasn't shy with the details of why I broke up with him. I was like, you're not a good person. We're not good together. Also, my high school fling has been really nice to me. And I think I am more interested in pursuing that at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And he got drunk. This was in like March 2020. It was like very early
Wow.
into quarantine. We were living together, so we couldn't escape having to deal with each other. And he just came back in drunk one night. He's like, I'm a Paula. Like, I don't know if I agree with that, but I can see why you feel that way.
Yeah, that's an insane thing to yell in like a real life argument.
In a real life context, it was bonkers.
Yeah, that is one element that the movie doesn't like explicitly like dive deeper in, which I kind of wish they did, was this idea that the people that like that you like hook up with or you're like emotionally connected with when you're like in your like late teens or early 20s and those like formative years, that you kind of form like an attachment to those people like as you get older still, just because they're like the first person that like you did certain things with, because that's the only thing that connects these two characters, right? Is that they had like a one night stand when they were in college and then basically never spoke ever again, but they kind of come back to each other. And instead of going into like the psychology of that they have a connection because they lost their virginity to each other, or do the movie thing where they say, oh, they're soulmates and that's why they just keep coming back and finding each other. That's the reason for that. They just don't dive into it at all. They're just like, oh, they live in New York people, they run into each other all the time.
I mean, I think that's more true to life though. Like you have those relationships with people in your formative years, and then you'll probably see them again, and it's not always going to be like a big thing. And sometimes you do just become like best friends with them.
Right.
Yeah, when I first saw this movie, I sympathized a lot with Paula's character because she's the one who gets like heartbroken, probably ends up hurt the most by the end of it. And I was like, well, she didn't do anything wrong. And then the woman that I was dating at the time was like, yeah, Jason, you're a Paula. And then she broke up with me a month later.
They're using this person's name as an adjective?
I guess. In my relationship, I was a Paula. And I guess in Georgia's relationship, her ex claimed to be a Paula.
What is a Paula? Just like a third wheel?
I guess that would make me a Jake. Paula is like somebody who like didn't do anything wrong and was maligned because two other people fell in love. And my ex's fatal flaw was he was never able to like see that his actions had consequences, and it was much easier for him to believe that I was all at fault when it was more nuanced than that. And I think both of us at the end probably were not being as great to each other as we should have been. So when he was coming in shouting, I'm a Paula, he was basically saying, I've done nothing wrong.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like he was actually a Paula.
No, definitely not.
I don't think I am either, just because that character has her life together and I don't.
There's nothing wrong with being a Paula.
Yeah.
Other than like knowing when the person you're dating is not that into you.
Okay, Dylan, which character do you identify with out of all these characters?
I don't know. It's tough to say because I don't really relate to any of these people. It's very difficult for me to watch any movie where there's just these like random dudes that can just pull women without like putting any like serious effort in. It's just like, hey, you want to go on a date? And then there's just like a hard cut of them like at a Chinese restaurant together. It's a movie thing. It is not that easy.
I gotta disagree with you there. Jason Sudeikis is very charming in this movie.
Yeah, that's probably our biggest disagreement. I'm almost afraid to say this. I think Jason Sudeikis is completely miscast in this role. I think there's like a dozen other actors that would make this movie more believable. I was telling Jason in the middle of the movie, you could swap out Jason Sudeikis with Joel McHale. Who,
honestly, even Adam Brody, I think, could have done the role. But I love Sudeikis in this role. I think he's actually best cast in this movie than he is in Ted Lasso.
It's such a weird role for him
Lasso.
because, like you say, you work in comedy, right? Like Jason Sudeikis was a SNL guy, yeah, and then he went into like more of like the writer side of things, and then he became a comedy actor, and then starting in probably with this movie, he tried to make more of a turn into like romantic leads in like rom-com type movies. And like it kind of didn't work for him for a while until like Ted Lasso happened. He was kind of like on like a downturn of his career a bit.
Well, there were several independent movies he did. Like there was another rom-com he did with Anne Hathaway. It didn't work for me at all. But this worked out great because I could see I feel like I could see his actual personality in it. I was a big SNL fan, so seeing him on interviews, going to see like even We're the Millers, like feel like that is closer to his actual personality, at least the one that he portrays publicly, than Ted Lasso is. And again, I really can't stomach Ted Lasso at all.
Yeah, because it's an interesting role for him because he's basically playing this guy that has like the like ultimate confidence and charisma, and it's like he has a superpower basically of he can just pull any woman that he looks at. Everything he does, he's batting 1,000. Everything he does works in this movie. He's like, I'm going to go up to my boss who just signed me to this like multi-million-dollar contract to work at this business, and I'm just going to date her. Actually, fuck it, because I can. However, the beginning of the movie shows him is like some like nerdy guy that hangs out in his like residence hall all the time. He has like this like messy looking bedroom with like books and computers and stuff behind him. He's a weird like avatar character to look into because it goes back to this idea of When Harry Met Sally for assholes. Like, is he? Are we supposed to think this is a good guy, or are we supposed to look at him and like this guy's an asshole, and we're not supposed to be happy that like he can just date any woman he looks at?
I think you're supposed to look at him like he's an asshole that you can't help but like, and I think that's my biggest crux with like this role versus Ted Lasso, because Ted Lasso is supposed to be like the most likable guy on earth. And yet here I like can't do it. And I think that's the juxtaposition for me.
Yeah, I wish they would have leaned more into them being assholes.
Yeah,
because listen, we know Jason Sudeikis can be an asshole. I've seen the report of him and Olivia Wilde what they would do to their housekeeper. Okay, right. He's not the nicest guy in real life, so no. He could have pulled into that a little bit. But it's weird. It's weird when like you have lead characters that the director wants them to be unlikable, but they're portrayed as kind of likable, and so it doesn't hit on either end properly. So it ends up somewhere in the middle. Any review for this movie you look at, people go, this is definitely one of the movies of all time. It's difficult to like have any sort of like extreme feelings for it.
I don't think it's like a mediocre movie. I do like this movie, but I do think if they leaned into the asshole of it a little bit more, it might have helped it stand out a little bit. This movie didn't have a wide release and didn't make a lot of money, but Georgia, you might know more about it. Like, did this movie make money in like streaming or like other ways?
So truthfully, I don't think so. I think that the people who love this movie, and it's got its own cult following in that sense. But I don't think it was ever like a critical success, which is why I have a hard time saying I could never describe it as overrated, because in order for it to be overrated, it would have to have this fanatic fan base. And as far as I know, I've been operating alone over here. So
yeah, like how many people have seen this movie, did not see it at some film festival that it debuted in?
I found it completely by chance, like a few weeks after it debuted, strictly because I was like perusing like the upcoming film section on Wikipedia. That's the only way I found it. I think almost half of the views that it's gotten since then, I have to have driven.
I think that's true. I have a page up in another tab here, which is just a Twitter search of your handle and then the word sleeping with other people. It's like 50 Twitter comedians that I know all being like, Georgia, thank you for showing me this movie. Or Georgia, I finally watched this so we can be friends. It's insane.
I was looking at this movie on Letterboxd, and this movie's on a Letterboxd list called like movies about women for women by women or something like that. Like movies with like a female director, female writer, female lead. I'm actually curious, like, I mean, is this movie like meant for women specifically, you think?
I think it's definitely written with a woman's gaze in mind. Like, especially Sudeikis' character. I don't think he's the kind of guy that like men watch a rom-com and they're like, I can see why women would fall in love with him. But every woman you show is going to be like, no, he's hot. Like,
yeah, that's what I was telling Jason. The kid's birthday party scene and the soccer scene later in the movie is pure dad core.
Right.
And I'm like, this is not like shit that like men would be interested in, but I'm sure like women would watch this and be like, oh my God, they're so good with kids.
Right.
This is great.
It's like pure, it's really Laurel and Yanny. The dress blue and black, there's a white and gold.
Yeah.
And to me, he's hot. And I completely understand why somebody else would look at it and see something totally different.
So I'm trying to think off the top of my head here. Does this movie pass the Bechdel test, do you think?
Oh, no. I don't think so. I don't think so. I'm trying to think. There's only a few scenes where
with women talking to other women.
Yeah, exactly. Like Natasha Lyonne.
But she's only in scenes when they're talking about relationship stuff. Yeah,
exactly. And the other scene I can think of would be like the kid's birthday party scene. But even then, I really don't think so. I'm scraping my mind to try to think of anything else they could have talked about.
I guess at one point Natasha Lyonne shows up with a woman and tells Lainey she's a lesbian.
Yeah, her girlfriend.
Yeah, there's a brief lesbian cameo scene, like it's a Disney movie.
The only other thing I can think of is when Lainey meets Matthew Sovicek's wife at like the end of the film. They're like asking her what she does for work.
Is that Catherine Watterson? Is that his wife?
I cannot remember the actress.
Hold on, I have the cast in front of me. It is. I don't know. I'm not familiar with this actress.
Yeah, she's in one of the Alien movies. She's in the first Fantastic Beasts movie. I think she's in the second one too, and then gets written out of the third one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Really interesting cast. That's why I was like, $3 million doesn't sound right for the budget of this movie. But again, like you said, it was all shot on location in New York. And this is a TV writer and director, so I'm guessing she knew how to like keep the budget low.
Also, if I remember correctly, they filmed it in like a very short period of time. It was like 30 or 45 days. And a lot of the locations were like small businesses where they either knew the owners or they could like walk in and be like, hey, do you mind if we film here? The entire scene where they're on the boat is ADR'd. I think they just hopped on a public ferry.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I think there's like a lot of like small independent comedy films where an SNL alum can just kind of pull their friends together and make it for $3 million or under. Yeah, like Georgia, if you wanted to make a movie, you would know like 50 up and coming comedians that you could call on to help you, right?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. So that's just kind of how it works when you're in like a tight knit community of talent. Georgia, do you have a tattoo of this movie?
I do have a tattoo of this movie. It was right around the time I hit 10,000 followers on Twitter. I tweeted out, if I hit 10,000 by the end of the day, I'll get the Sleeping with Other People tattoo. And I did. And I got the like a single line drawing of when they say I love you for free on this side of my rib.
That's really cool. Yeah, truly a diehard fan. Okay, so before we argue whether this is overrated or underrated, which we've kind of been doing throughout, we have to talk about where we think it's rated. Currently in the public mind, on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you think people feel about this movie, considering both whether or not they like it and whether or not they've seen it?
For me, I would call it a 10 out of 10. And my goal is to make everybody see it.
Right.
But I know that realistically, it's probably like a 7 out of 10 of the few that I have gotten to watch it.
Jason's like, we can't do 10 out of 10. It's going to make my argument impossible.
Yeah, I think just since so few people have seen it, it's like not really in the public consciousness at all. Hopefully it will be after this podcast. But I would go like much lower. I think the people who have seen it generally like it. Like it's got like a 60 something on Rotten Tomatoes. But yeah, I would say this is like a 5 out of 10, just like a good indie comedy that not a lot of people have seen. Dylan, what do you think?
Yeah, I think this is one of the few times, and I think we try to be a little bit more nuanced when we're making these ratings, but where I would lean a little more on just the Rotten Tomatoes score, where I mean, Rotten Tomatoes, obviously, it's not that people are rating it as 6 out of 10. It's how many, like, what percentage of critics are rating it favorably. And I think like 6 out of 10 is probably pretty fair. I think it just hits that line of like base competency for like a good movie versus a bad movie. So obviously, just like any movie, there's going to be people that really connect to it. And every movie is somebody's favorite movie.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So we'll call it like a 6 out of 10. And the two of us who are arguing that this is underrated, we want to get that number higher in the public mind. So Dylan, you think this movie is overrated, and you truly believe this.
I do. Yeah.
Why? Go ahead and tell us why.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, we've been kind of talking about it. This is the whole podcast. I mean, 3 things that mainly make this movie overrated in my eye. Number one is that there's just better rom-coms than this movie. If you're going to watch a movie that's like a riff on When Harry Met Sally, like just watch When Harry Met Sally. It's a better movie. It's a tighter movie. Number 2, I don't think it does a very good job in the romantic side of things or the comedy side of things. We did a Notebook episode recently, which is a very good film showing like 2 people falling in love with each other and, going through some rocky patches throughout the film. Like, it's a good film structure. This movie does not have that. The movie many times will just openly have them call each other best friends, even though, once again, these are 2 people in their mid-30s who have not talked since the one time they met in college and they had sex with each other, but they're best friends now. And then they're in love with each other, and they have that scene, which I was reading on Letterboxd. People love that "I love you for free" line. They think it's super romantic. I think it's super cheesy, and I think it's a screenwriter writing what they want the audience to know about the movie without having to infer it and see it on the screen. And then number 3 is that, like, you've got all these amazing actors in this movie, and you think that it almost can't fail because of the strength of the acting talent. But I think there's just a lot of actors in this movie that are a little bit out of their depth. I think Sudeikis is a bit miscast for this role. I think if you took a guy that had more like natural charisma and is more like well known as a guy that is like a leading man, or like a leading man in a romantic sense, I think of like Paul Rudd. Like, would Paul Rudd be like better in this role? Would he be more believable as this guy that can like pull any woman that he talks to because he's so charming? Maybe. Or like Adam Scott, who is like, it's funny seeing Adam Scott in this movie because it's just like, is Adam Scott with a mustache? And but he feels miscast because like what that actor is like in other roles. He doesn't. When you look at Step Brothers, he's an asshole in Step Brothers too. You feel like it would be believable, but I'm sorry, you can go ahead.
It's okay. Even in Bachelorette, which is the other Leslie Headland movie, he's playing a character that's very similar to Jake, and he's hot in that movie, but disgusting in this one. Again, from like a female gaze. And I think it really, I don't know, like Leslie Headland has said that she's like addicted to casting Adam Scott as like the guy who broke her heart. And I can totally see that. I can totally see Adam Scott being the guy who broke my heart, anything like that. But I don't know. I think, would Paul Rudd work in this role? I don't think he would, in like terms of the kind of person that I like know in real life who is this guy. And I think when you look at like more of like a traditional rom-com from the early to late 2000s, they're just not guys that I see in real life. Whereas Jake is somebody I could name like 5 guys who he absolutely is.
Yeah,
that's fair. My third big gripe of the film is that there's just a real lack of conflict. There is no moment where the 2 have to like split off from one another. There's no big fight. They don't have a big fight in the movie. And I feel like that would have, from at least like a pacing perspective, make the film a lot easier to follow. Whereas like the big conflict in this movie is like she gets into medical school and has to move out of state, which from like, a female empowerment standpoint, you should be like, great, she's like living her dream, she's going to go be a doctor. but like as soon as he calls her up and he's like, hey, do you want to get back together? And it's like, I don't know if the movie's doing this intentionally, but she's almost like, oh, fuck the school, like I'm gonna go fall in love with this guy, I'm heading back to him.
They fly back to the med school the next day.
Yeah, they go right back, which is interesting. Yeah, the whole like climax of the film where like he punches Adam Scott in the face and then gets it's a real mess of like a sequence of scenes. It's almost like she didn't know exactly how to end it to get them back together. And
right,
because again, that's another complete coincidence that they're in the same restaurant at the same time. Who knows? Maybe New York is smaller than I realized, and there's only a handful of restaurants that people go to. These people that went to Columbia.
There's a bunch.
When I was in New York, I would go to restaurants and then I would like see Alison Brie there. It is kind of smaller than you think. So I could argue some of these points, Dylan, but Georgia, I feel like when I listened to your podcast about this, some of the things that Dylan just criticized were things that you said were like your favorite parts of the movie.
What I would say is that like the strong point to me in this movie is that it is like a very grounded, realistic way that people fall in love and fall apart. And I think that for me, that's a strong point where like in real life, when you break up with people, there's not always a big fight. There's not always like a big dramatic fallout or a fight scene. It's, well, things didn't work out and she has to go follow her dreams. And he's like totally supportive of that, doesn't push her. I think it does influence his decision to stay with Paula a bit more at the end. Mm-hmm. But it's not a negative to me. I can see how that narratively would make for like a less like well-paced movie. But for me, that is something that like sets it apart and makes it stand out.
Yeah, I would definitely say that a lot of the issues I have with the movie are like film structure issues more than I guess like plot issues themselves. Like if you look at most other rom-coms that are in this like similar structure, you kind of start with like a base cast of like 4 people, right? You have the 2 main characters that you want to fall in love at the end of the movie, and then you have like the 2 other people that are kind of there as like a means to like separate them, you know, the man and the woman that like they're with like before they finally get back together at the end of the movie. And this film has such an ensemble cast of people that, you know, outside of Paula and like, what was that guy's name? Chris?
Matthew.
Like
Matthew.
Yeah,
Chris Smith.
Yeah, the random dad that is at the party. Like there's just like these characters that just like spawn in almost that are meant to be like the distraction from the main 2, but they don't seem significant enough.
Right. I'd agree with you on Lainey's front that Matthew Sobachek was never going to choose her and Chris Smith was never a big enough threat. Whereas with Paula, she is somebody that most audiences look at and sympathize for because she really has done nothing wrong.
And I guess like then also it goes to the question like why is Jason Sudeikis interested in her? Is it just because like she's his boss? Like it like is he just interested in her because she's hot? Is that the idea?
I think that he's interested in her because she's the one that's been saying no throughout the entire movie, and he finally gets her on the hook. And he's like the dog that's chasing its tail. He finally catches it, and he doesn't know what to do. Yeah,
it's a he wants what he can't have type thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I like this movie a lot. I agree with Georgia that it's like grounded and to me feels real. Maybe it is like a New York type of real, but I have seen like scenarios like this play out. I agree that like maybe there's no big fight, but her moving away and them just like deciding to talk about it instead. I think that was great. That's kind of one of my favorite scenes, even though they're eating ice cream that doesn't look like it has ice cream in it. I think that like a moment in a movie where it seems like there's a lot of tension and then one of the characters just says, do you want to talk about it? And then they do. I think that's cool. Like I've had moments like that in my life. So it was cool to see that on screen. I did think that these 2 lead performances were really good. And I think they had pretty decent chemistry with each other. So yeah, overall, I like this movie and I would like recommend it to other people.
I'm curious though, because the main question that this movie asks, and it's a question that you see a lot on like like manosphere podcasts and like those like TikToks of dudes like interviewing women in like Miami and shit. The idea of can men and women be friends with each other without like sex becoming a thing? Like, can men and women like legitimately be platonic friends with each other and just platonic friends with each other? And the answer to that, assuming you're like a rational human being, is yes. However, this movie kind of bucks that a little bit because despite the fact that, yes, they're friends for the entire movie, they do have sex and get married at the very end of this movie. So it's a little contradictory to that like central message.
Right. No, I agree with you there. There are platonic friendships that we see throughout the film, and you would like, let's say, Jason Sudeikis and Mantzoukas' wife. They're clearly there pretty frequently. They get along, they hang out on the reg, but it's not something that I think gets explored a lot deeper than that. And I know a lot of the arguments at the time this was released were that there were people who were angry that they ended up together in the end. But
yeah, I would agree that this movie, I actually might have like completely changed my tune on this movie if this film ended with them not together and they're just friends. Because then it's like fully in line with the message that the film's trying to send. Is just like, yeah, they're friends with each other. That's the whole thing. There's nothing like crazy about this. And then they completely flip it on its head by having him punch Adam Scott in the face and then get rid of poor Paula and her son. He's gonna have to go to soccer by himself now. and then him getting together with Alison Brie at the end. Weird. It's a weird like heel turn a little bit. It's one of those things where like I wish the movie was willing to take that risk, like willing to not be like stereotypical movie ending with it.
Yeah, I think that honestly would have made a very interesting movie, because one of the main reasons the "I love you for free" line is so revered is because they're saying I love you without expecting anything back for my love. And if they had completely gone those two separate ways, that message sticks home a lot harder than needing to get back together immediately.
Yeah, because you can love your friends platonically. I mean, I love Jason. You know, we're homies, but you know, we're not getting married anytime soon, not to my knowledge. So yeah, it would have been cool. It would have been a cool like bow to put on the whole film with the message there. Like one of my favorite like rom-coms, it's I guess like, more like a dramedy is 500 Days of Summer. And like 500 Days of Summer, you know, it's a different type of message, but like that movie, I guess spoilers, ends with the two main characters not being together and them understanding that like them just staying as friends is like the most healthy thing for the two of them and not to have like expectations and shit like that. It's like a realistic message. And you think like you're saying, this is a movie that's supposed to depict like a more like realistic showing of like what relationships are like between people. It just feels like an ending that makes more sense in my opinion.
I think I disagree with like the idea that the main theme is about men and women being friends platonically. I think the main theme is like these two people who need to work on themselves, and they do that through friendship, and then through that friendship they fall in love. And I think, Georgia, you said this on your podcast, it's about them having to fall in love with themselves
first. Yeah,
so that they feel like they can deserve that.
When I watch this movie, I look at it from the vantage point of Alison Brie. Why is she so obsessed with chasing Matthew Sobchak? It's because if he chooses her, then she can choose herself, because she's like finally gotten the thing in her head that she thinks will make everything all better. And I think the like win for her at the end is not getting with Jake. It's not even really leaving Matthew. It's like feeling complete with herself, and like that she can go off and do her own thing and be her own person. And that's enough. So that's like the real love story in this, is like falling in love with yourself first. And I think for Lainey, that gets accomplished. I don't necessarily know if it gets accomplished for Jake.
Do you think these two people stay together? You think this was a happily ever after?
You know, in the like romantic fairy tale aspect, I would love for them to. I don't know if they are making the most sound decision, like from a logical standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, they're shouting "I love you" at each other while he's surrounded by police. So it's definitely not logically sound, like their romance and the way it unfolds. But I think it is, relationships are messy, and even if they don't end up together forever, it's a relationship that healed both of them in a lot of ways. And that's an interesting movie for me to watch.
Yeah, I think he's cheating on her within like the first year of that marriage. The whole thing falls apart.
I hope not. It looks like, and again, I'm just looking at Georgia's tweets. There was talk of a sequel, or maybe there was still
talk of like a This Is 40-esque like sequel. I don't know if it ever got beyond the green light there. There was also talk of Leslie Headland writing like a thriller about marriage, like that going apart. So I don't think we're ever going to get it, but it was discussed, and I don't think things are as sunny there as they leave it off.
Yeah, what would you like to see from a sequel if there was going to be one?
I would love a spin-off about Mantzoukas and his wife.
Yeah, I love Jason Mantzoukas in anything, so that would be great. Cool. Do either of you guys have any final thoughts about this movie?
If you have a copy of the screenplay and you can get it over to me, send me an email at hello@georgiashenk.com because it's my white whale. I've been trying to find it for years.
Okay, yeah, we'll put the word out. Dylan, you got anything else?
Go watch When Harry Met Sally. It's very good.
Cool. Georgia, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Georgia Shenk, or on Instagram at Georgia Shenk, or at georgiashenk.com. I should be having some more essays being published later this year.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm really glad I finally got to talk to you and work with you on something. Been a big fan since we became Twitter mutuals.
Yeah, I've been a big fan of you since your Good Place Maximum Derek party.
Yeah, Jason Mantzoukas. I love that man. I pay tribute to him whenever I can. All right, that's going to be it for this episode. Thank you for watching or listening. Check us out on our socials and TikTok. Follow us on Patreon. And we will see you at the movies.
See you guys.
Bye.
Bye.